Hello everybody and welcome to Langer's Legion. I'm Langer and let's talk Star Wars Legion. In today's video, we're going to talk about army archetypes when it comes to building out your Star Wars Legion army. So let's get into it. When it comes to building an army for Star Wars Legion, especially, the standard 800 point army, there are a few basic army types or archetypes that your army list might fall into. And granted, there's not an exact science to this, but they're kind of the ones that, most people recognize or I probably identify when you kind of see what units are made up in these lists. So I thought I'd put together for maybe new players or even not so new players, kind of the 4 or 5 most common archetypes when it comes to building a Legion army list. And just like a lot of things on YouTube, this is just my opinion. So of course I welcome any thoughts or comments down below. So let's get started with kind of the basic, archetypes that you might see in a tabletop war game, such as obviously Star Wars Legion. You've got a kind of a few. Basically, you have your gunline, what would be called your hero hammer. Star Wars Legion specific, we'll call it a double bounty. A melee focused, or what might traditionally called a force user focus, and we'll have some comments on that further on in the video, as well as like a vehicle or a heavies weighted list when it comes to Star Wars Legion. And while all these lists are, somewhat categorized, you will see some elements of each other across all of them. I mean, there's no hard and fast rule, but it's more about when you're building an army and making up a list, you want that list to be focused on a certain thing. That way it's going to be good at that certain thing, right? So a gunline obviously focused on throwing out mini units with lots of aims and lots of guns and so on and so forth, double bounty, so on and so forth. But if you don't kind of take these ideas into account, if you have a list that does a lot of different things, you're not going to do any of them well, and more than likely you're going to do them poorly. So that's where you don't want to kind of like mix-mash or kind of take one from each of the categories, because you're just not going to have a really good synergy. So let's start with the most basic and probably one of the more common ones, a gunline. The tried and true when it comes to building an army for pretty much any tabletop war game. So gunline, pretty self-explanatory. This is all about kind of like getting all your units, lighting them up, and just basically shooting at your enemy. Now in Legion, this could be at range if you're using range 3 or 4 units, or if you're playing Shadow Collective and you have core units, or you're going to be that are kind of closer up, maybe it's a 1 to 2 range. The fact still remains, a lot of core units or maybe special forces units, and your point here is to have lots of activations, lots of guns, focused at your enemy, and hopefully you're going to be throwing a lot of dice. Now, obviously there's pros and cons to each of these lists. A gunline, probably the biggest con to it, at least in Star Wars Legion, is if you go up against possibly a melee list or a force user list, once a force user gets into your gunline, it can carve them up pretty quick, because usually you've got low defenses or low wound counts on these gun lines, and you can kind of lose units pretty quickly. But a great example of a gun line right now is kind of what I would refer to as the meta as it comes to the 501st Battle Force for Galactic Republic, and I did a video ranking different battle forces here. But just to give you an example of what that list would look like, you've got Anakin, you've got a clone commander, but really the gunline part comes here with all these phase 2 clone trooper units, as well as the ability, at least for this battle force, to bring 4 special forces units in the army list. So you've got all these ARC troopers kitted out with the sniper rifle, so you're getting that long range, and then you've got a strike team with Echo. And this kind of is a great list. Again, just represents that gunline. You've got force barrier for Anakin, trying to give them some defense from shots, and you're just kind of like moving all these things around, token sharing, and really taking your shots at at distance from this gunline perspective. So kind of a good starting point, just an example from a gunline from at least from the Galactic Republic. The next up is kind of the double bounty, and I think this one should be pretty self-explanatory. It's kind of the names in the title. Is basically you're taking 2 bounty hunters to in your list that are going to give you the ability to gain extra victory points if you, aka, kill the bounties. Basically, the tokens you're going to put on an operative or a commander against your opponent. And the benefit with the double bounty is, again, you're playing the objectives as well as you're going to try and play to capture those bounties to get the victory points. And the trade-off with double bounty lists is, now granted, you're going to get some great named characters from the bounty hunters. Those are going to take up a lot of points, right? So you're going to be making up your army basically with core units, or maybe a speckle or two of special force units. But really, it's a powerful archetype. You get good command cards because, again, you're taking multiple bounty hunters and you still need a commander. So you've kind of got some strong play in that regard. And it's a good way to kind of keep your opponent somewhat on their heels, because they got to kind of think about what they're going to do with their operatives or commanders, or how far forward they're going to bring them on the tabletop, because, of course, they're going to be potentially in range of those bounty hunters. So let's give you an example of a double bounty empire list. I've got IG-88 in here with Boba Fett. I'm using General Veers as the commander. He's actually kind of cheap enough where you can get a decent commander with spotter, and he's got some great command cards, as opposed to maybe going with, like, let's say, Imperial Officer Ruthie. And then you're going to see elements of a gunline, right? So we've gotten these two pretty expensive units, how they're kitted out. They're probably in the 125 to 150 range. So you got to fill up that list somewhere else. And remember, you saw I have to take 3 core units. So I've got shore troopers, I've got some stormtroopers, and I've got that mortar unit in there to give me that core requirement. And then I'm bringing some scout trooper strike teams, again, for that distance, that ranged gun line where I'm being able to snipe at range 5 with a Pierce weapon. And then this is just offsets, because that's a pretty cheap unit, each of the Imperial strike teams. So that gives you an idea of the double bounty. Next up is the Hero Hammer. Now, while this is going to be similar to the double bounty in the fact that you're basically taking, again, named units, right? So these are the users that you're used to from the movies or from the TV shows, that you're going to take Cassian, or you're going to take Ahsoka Tano, like you're going to see in this example, where, again, you're taking these named units that are going to bring more to the tabletop. They're usually going to have better keywords, or you're going to have some command cards. But unlike the double bounty, of course, you're still using them to capture objectives and go after your enemy. And with this list, with Ahsoka, you've got a Force user in there that can get in there with their lightsaber and kind of, slice and dice the bad guys, let's say. With this list, you're definitely still going to be playing more objectives, unlike the bounty hunter, because you don't have those victory points. But it's a way to get in there with, again, some good command cards, multiple named characters or heroes that can, do some damage against your opponent. So let's take a look at an example of the Hero Hammer for Rebels. So I've got Cassian. You've got Ahsoka Tano in here. If you're going to take Cassian, you want to get K2SO in there with his incognito and kind of how their teamwork lines up. I've got some FD cannons, Rebel commandos with snipers. You're going to see a lot of these strike teams because, again, they're just good, cheap units to kind of fill out a roster when, points are valuable. And then, of course, I've got the required 3 units of core with the Rebel veterans coming along with the Mark II medium blaster. So again, pretty good list. Another one that I've seen a lot in the competitive scene from a Hero Hammer perspective for the Rebels. Now, brings us to our next one, and this would probably traditionally be called a Force user list. Usually if it's heavily focused on Vader, who costs a lot of points, or maybe Yoda, or even Palpatine, right? These are very expensive Force users that you're going to want to get into base contact, get into that melee combat, and slice and dice your opponent. But I kind of rebranded this one Melee because we've got this really new Wookiee battle force, the Wookiee Defenders, that can be built in a very, very melee-focused or melee-heavy regard, and we'll get into that here in a second. So I've kind of changed this just to a melee, but of course it can capture Force users as well. But again, you're just looking for that nasty damage from your Force users. Here's an example using Blizzard Force. So you've got Commander Vader, Burst of Speed, Saber Throw, Improvise Orders, and Force Push, kind of a standard Vader build. But you notice, that's a very expensive build out for Vader. So really, after that, I've got some core units. I've got the must-take Stormtrooper HRUs, but I did throw a couple of Stormtroopers in there with the medical droid, because really your real oomph in this list is going to come from keeping Vader upright and then eventually getting him into your opponent's list with that lightsaber and slicing and dicing and leveraging his command cards. So giving those extra wounds for the medical droids and maybe possibly using the snows to potentially hold on objectives. That's kind of how this list is going to go down. And then you're going to see I've got the 4 speeder bikes because in Blizzard Force you can take 4. And that's really going to be a good way to flank or put pressure on your opponent as you're trying to move Vader up the field or up the table to get into that base contact of your opponent. But like I said, there's this additional wrinkle with the Wookiee Battle Force that just came out, the Wookiee Defenders, where if you really lean into that Wookiee, all Wookiee kind of meta of it, you can build a very nasty hit the W key, move forward on the table Wookiee list where you could look at bringing a total of 79 wounds that your opponent would have to inflict on you, not counting surges or blocks, right? So your competitor, your opponent is going to have to throw a lot of wounds and a lot of dice against this list. But if you get into base contact with all these different Wookiees, you could really, really cause some damage to your opponent. So what does that look like? You're really only taking 3 unit types. You've got the Wookiee Chieftain for your commander. We're taking Chewie as another commander. And then you're seeing the Wookiee Warriors. And I went with the Noble Fighters because, again, this is a melee focused list. But you're able to cram 7 of these units into this list. So you're looking at 9 activations, all heavily melee focused. Again, like I said, moving up that table and trying to get into base contact with your opponent. That's why I've got Recon Intel stapled in all these cats. You've got Into the Fray to trying to give out those surge tokens. You've got Tenacity for that extra, red dice in your attack pool. I'm not saying this is going to be a meta list or, super competitive because there's obviously things that this could fall apart on from an objective base, especially if hostage exchange came up because there's no core units in here. But just gives you an example of what a melee-focused Wookiee Defender list would look like and the amount of wounds and how much damage you could do to your opponent or how much you would have to take to start clearing off all these minis off the table. And last but not least, you have what I would call a vehicle or a heavy unit-based army list or archetype. And these focus on those heavy units that A, usually cost a lot of points, or B, they carry the armor keyword. So you're talking about ATSTs, you're talking about the Snail Tank, Dark Troopers for Empire. These are units that cost a lot, they bring armor, and they're really hard to get off the table. And that kind of brings you to this vehicle / heavies list. Now, granted, you might see this from the other factions, but I'm assuming if somebody's going to be playing a list like this, this is definitely going to be an Empire player. Like I said, they're going to bring, like we talked about double bounty, they're going to bring double darks, and maybe that's in a generic Empire list, or maybe they're going to play them in the Imperial Remnant Battle Force. Either way, Dark Troopers are just super nasty with their double activations, their armor keywords. So it's just something that you have to be aware of when they're on the tabletop. Or maybe you're doing Blizzard Force, which we gave an example of before, but instead of maybe going with Veers or Vader, you're going with Veers with an ATST, or keep beating up on these battle forces. You've got Tempest Force that came out for the Ewok expansions and the 40th anniversary of Return of the Jedi, where you're going to take possibly, in this example, 2 ATSTs where you've got Major Marquand, who's a named character who is going to be your commander in a ATST. Bring a second along with the Hammered's pilot, link targeting array so you can get that free aim from the Major. Bring in some speeder bikes, only 2 pair, but again, just something to flank with or keep your opponent honest. And then with this battle force, you can only take scout troopers or stormtroopers, and you have to take 1 stormtrooper unit. So I've got scout troopers loaded up. I got 4 base units of those with emergency transponder on all 4 of them. And then 2 pairs of them have, or 2 sets of them have up close and personal. And then I've got the stormtroopers with the astromech. Again, even though you've got the armored keyword on the ATSTs, they do roll white saves, so they can be melted pretty quickly. And since the Major is your commander, you're going to want to keep that up. So we bring along an astromech just to kind of restore at least 2 wounds and try to keep him on the table as long as possible, or as long enough at least to use his named command cards. So with that, that's a quick rundown of the various archetypes that I see when it comes to Star Wars Legion. Again, you can mix and match these. There's probably other types that folks can come up with, but I feel like these are kind of the core ones that you're going to be building around or that you're going to see either on your kitchen table or at your local game store. But I welcome any comments or thoughts on what you thought of these lists. Again, any suggestions or ones that I might have missed that you think are more common, post them down below. But until the next time, hail to the Empire.